Thank you so much, Yoeri, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's such a pleasure to be back at Bali, not least because the previous times that I've come here have actually played a great part in inspiring me in wanting to write this new book, and indeed to stress test some of the themes, some of the subjects. So I've come here and I've talked variously about the beginnings of Islam and about the Psalms and about Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, and the Second World War. And all of these elements are within the new book. And I think that the argument of the book is a sweeping one. And I don't think I would have had the nerve to embark on it if I had not had the chance to come to places like Bali and stress test them. So I'm very grateful to be back here and have the chance to talk about it. And yes, the book is, as the English subtitle has it, kind of about the making of the Western mind. But ladies and gentlemen, the making of the Western mind is a subtitle I did not choose. It was chosen by my very, very nervous, very, very atheistical, very, very enthusiast for the Enlightenment-esque editor in London, who felt that any mention of Christianity on the cover, whether in the form of, a cross or whether in terms of the subtitle, might put people off. It's not really about the making of the Western mind. The Dutch subtitle alludes to what it really is. It's about the making of Christendom and how Christendom has made us. And the argument really can be summed up very simply, that the coming of Christianity, its incubation and its emergence and its evolution in the world of classical antiquity is the most decisively revolutionary moment, certainly in European history, and I think very possibly globally as well. And that the idea that I had in the back of my mind as I was writing it was that the West, the modern West, if that's a goldfish bowl and we're the goldfish, then the waters that we swim in are Christian. But then when I'd finished it, another metaphor struck me. There was a TV series was shown in England about Chernobyl. It was a drama. And there was a scene where two of the apparatchiks who were trying to control this terrible rupture in the power station are right up close to the radiation leak. And they look up and you can see the radioactivity leaking because it is ionizing the air. But then, of course, the threat from the radiation is that as it spreads across the forests of Ukraine, as it reaches Kiev, as it reaches Scandinavia, as it reaches Amsterdam, the radioactivity is invisible. But people are still breathing it in. People are still being affected by it, even though they may not be aware that it's affecting them. And by that, I do not mean to say that Christianity makes your hair drop out and kills you, but just that its effects may not be obviously apparent. So if you are, in the kind of cathedral that we had in the opening graphic, that's kind of like being up close and seeing the air ionizing. If you're thinking about the Crusades or Thomas Aquinas or the Pilgrim Fathers, of course you're completely aware that Christianity is having this transformative effect. But if you are thinking about things that may not seem to be distinctively Christian at all, if you're thinking about categories like homosexuality, if you're thinking about categories like the secular, even if you're thinking about categories like the very concept of religion, all of which we may be tempted to take for granted. In fact, we should not take these for granted. None of them are categories that would have meant anything to people in the Roman Empire. They are highly culturally contingent, and they are bred of the depths of Christian history, of Christian theology, and as I am reminded by today's reading that we just heard, by Christian scripture. And it's a kind of classic Balie maneuver that I've never really talked about this before. But of course, one of the many ways in which Christianity has shaped and molded us in ways, again, that we often may not be aware of, is through the impact of biblical stories and biblical poetry and biblical imagery. And this is something that I was already reflecting upon before I realized that this was what Yoeri had arranged to have. Yesterday I went to Leiden. This morning I went to Haarlem. And as every foreigner who comes here inevitably is, one is struck by the beauty and the kind of self-confidence of the centers of these beautiful towns, these expressions of the Dutch Golden Age. And of course, what it was that made the Dutch Republic so successful, so culturally productive, so wealthy, is the subject of huge amounts of historiographical inquiry. People write about the economy, people write about all kinds of aspects. But it seems clear to me that a crucial part of it is the sense the Dutch in the 17th century have of themselves as a new Israel. And of course, both Haarlem and Leiden absolutely focus that. Both were the objects of great sieges. And the fact that Haarlem was eventually conquered didn't drive the Dutch to despair, because they had the assurance that even though Jerusalem had fallen to the Babylonians, nevertheless, the God of Israel did not abandon his people. And so the Dutch could have the assurance that their God would not abandon them. And that was a sense that was sharpened for them by the fact that Leiden did not surrender, and that the flood waters came and drowned the chariots of Pharaoh. And the Dutch could imagine themselves as a people redeemed from slavery, offered a new land, a new prospect. And this sense in which our minds, all our minds, because my country too, England, the beginning of England, the first history we have of England written by a monk called Bede. Again, in Bede's account, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes come to Britain and are given this land. And whenever there are kings who are ungodly, who oppose the coming of the church, fascinating thing, they all drown, like Pharaoh. So again, this sense the English have of themselves as a chosen people, the sense the Dutch have of themselves as a chosen people. This is part of the fabric of how all of us as Europeans conceive of ourselves. And of course, this has been for good. It has fostered, it's helped foster the astonishing civilizational achievements of the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. But it's also not necessarily been positive for certain people in the rest of the world. So when the Dutch go to South Africa and they settle there, again, they consider themselves a chosen people. And this, of course, is bad news for the equivalent of the Canaanites, who find that their land has been given to people who are claiming it in the name of God. And again, over and over, and again, the English, when they go to North America, when they go to South Africa, when they go to Australia, again, this is a part of the narrative that they also like to tell about themselves. And so, the power of these stories has literally shaped the way that European history has evolved. They've been written and rewritten over again, kind of like palimpsests. And these stories continue to, I think, affect and shape the way that Europe functions and has behaved over the course of the past few years. Yoeri mentioned the book culminates with Angela Merkel and Viktor Orban. Now, I do not think that Angela Merkel would have let 1 million people from a different part of the world, different cultural background, into her country if she had not been raised in the parsonage of her Lutheran pastor father, absorbing not just moral principles, ethical principles, but absorbing stories. And Jesus, among many other things, Jesus has to rank as the most influential teller of short stories who's ever existed. And perhaps one of his most influential stories is the story of the Good Samaritan. The idea that we all have a responsibility to care for people who may be very different to us. And the power of the moral teaching embedded in that story is implicit in the narrative. And it's something I think that historians, philosophers, even theologians may forget, the power of a simple narrative. And yet that story, that parable that Christ told, continues to reverberate into the present. But of course, again, there are many contradictory ways in which this inheritance of biblical narratives can impact on us. Because just as the Dutch at the siege of Haarlem or the siege at Leiden saw themselves as a godly people resisting enemies who, like the Midianites or the Assyrians or the Babylonians, environed them around. So also for Viktor Orban, the leader of a nation that had been occupied by the Ottomans for many centuries, so also was he able to draw on the biblical heritage to cast his people as a people environed around. Equally Christian, equally shaped by the power of Christian narratives, of biblical narratives, but leading to very different conclusions, very different results. And I think that when you look at the totality of Christian and European history, what is striking is not just the potency of certain ideas, certain moral teaching, certain ethical teaching, certain ways of conceiving the world, all of which are hugely important. But it is also the power of narratives, the power of certain images. And we heard one of them in the reading that this event began with. In him, the Word, was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And those lines are, as so often in the New Testament, drawing on images and ideas in the Old, and specifically the lines of Isaiah, that the people who walk in darkness have seen a great light. They've been lost in the murk, and now illumination has come to them, enlightenment has come to them. And this is a way of seeing the world. The world is lost in darkness and light has come. That will inspire the very first generations of Christians to venture out into a world that they see as lost to idolatry and superstition and darkness, and bring them light. And again, in the early Middle Ages, when say people from newly converted England come to the Netherlands and plant their rough churches among the Frisian wilds, and then go further east again into the forests of Saxony, Boniface, man from my own southwest of England, one of the very few saints to have had a nuclear power station named after him, I'm proud to say, ventures into the forests of Saxony, and he chops down a tree, a great tree of Thunor, as an emblem of his his determination to destroy superstition, to banish idolatry, and to bring the people who live in the murk of those Saxon forests into the light of Christ. And this becomes a crucial way in which the church, the medieval church, what becomes the Roman church over the course of the Middle Ages, sees itself. It is a beacon of light. It is the enemy of idolatry. It is the enemy of superstition. But then, of course, in the 16th century, that gets turned against it. It's part of what is at issue when the Dutch and the Spanish are facing off against one another, is that the Dutch Protestants have come to see the Church of Rome as the embodiment of superstition and idolatry. And for Protestants, the idea of enlightenment, the idea that the heart can be opened up to the Spirit and light can blaze all around, becomes a crucial part of their self-image. And over the course of the 17th century in the Netherlands, this is a fundamental concept, the idea that enlightenment can blaze amid darkness. And by the 18th century, this concept has come to be turned not just against the Roman Church, but against the Christian Church itself, against the very fabric of Christianity, against the very idea of what has come to be defined as religion. And the idea of the Enlightenment, a blaze of light that all can access across the world, from Shanghai to Lima, is a crucial part of the way in which the philosophes and then the revolutionaries in France conceive themselves. And they see this as a new beginning, a bringing of the people who walked in darkness into light, a rejection of superstition, a toppling of idols. And yet even to put it in those terms is to demonstrate how fundamentally Christian it remains. How deeply, when we talk about enlightenment, when we condemn Christianity as superstition, when we say that we have toppled the idols, we are just replicating themes and images and stories that go back over the 2,000 years of Christian history and back even before the coming of Christianity to the writings of the Hebrew prophets. And I've increasingly come over the course of writing this book and then talking about it to think that it's almost impossible to escape this legacy, to stand outside it. The very process of trying to emancipate oneself from Christianity merely tangles one up in its web even more. And whether that is something to be celebrated, I increasingly think it is, or whether it is something to be deplored, is in a sense irrelevant. It is just, as I said beginning, it is the waters in which all of us swim. Thank you.
Tom Holland, thank you. Maybe you want a bit of water.
The water of life.
In that sense, everything becomes symbolic. But you are saying, among many, many other things, but that we cannot even begin to understand how much we have been shaped by Christian history, by the coming of Christendom into the classical world, and by the shaping of the events around the year 0 and the year 33 of antiquity and the mingling of Roman and Greek traditions and Hebrew traditions into the church and to Christendom.
Yes, I mean the background for my ending up wanting to write this book is that initially I did not have any great interest in Christianity. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that as a child, I kind of resented it. What I really loved was the glamour and the swagger of Rome. Mm-hmm. And I loved
your first bestseller, Rubicon?
Yeah, well, I loved the gladiators, I loved the legions, I loved the emperors, I loved the purple, I loved the eagles and standards. Mm-hmm. And then, a load of monks turn up and ruin it.
Yeah.
There's a famous line of English poetry the poet Swinburne puts into the mouth of Julian the Apostate, the nephew of Constantine, who tries to reverse the coming of Christianity.
Yeah, and he calls it the stinking herring of Jerusalem, isn't it?
Yes, but supposedly
his
his last he dies in a kind of terrible war in Persia, and his last phrase is supposedly, "Thou hast conquered Galilee, and you have turned the whole world grey with thy breath."
Yeah.
And that was, as a child, very much the idea I had, that, and a kind of almost synesthetic sense that the world of Greece and Rome has bright skies, the blaze of the Parthenon or the Colosseum.
White marble.
Yes, and white marble, which of course is also wrong.
Yeah.
And then Christianity comes and the sun vanishes behind dark cloud, and then the whole of the Middle Ages is kind of lowering
You've got these grey monks
until you get to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and then the light comes back on. So it's a very, I was very much persuaded by what I only gradually came to see as being a kind of fundamentally Christian myth that the Enlightenment tells about itself. I was kind of totally bought into the idea that there was classical antiquity, which was light. Then there's murk and darkness.
The Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, actually. Yeah.
And then there's the 18th century, and the light switches go back on.
Yeah.
Now, it was precisely the fact that writing about the Romans, not as a child but as an adult, required me to stare into the depths of this myth. Because even when I was writing Rubicon, and the conceit of Rubicon was that ancient Rome, the Roman Republic, held a mirror up to the American Republic, which at the time I was writing it was being hit by 9/11 and then was gearing up to the Gulf War. Yeah. So there were lots of seeming parallels that I could kind of make play with. But it was kind of clear to me, even when I was writing that the world of Rome was kind of unimaginably and kind of innocently callous compared to our own. Whatever my friends thought about the Gulf War, going on the demonstrations against it, what struck me was how the enormous lengths that the United States was going to not to kill people.
Yeah.
Whereas Julius Caesar was absolutely celebrating how many people he killed.
Yeah, but you described it in Rubicon very, very vividly, how many people he killed and how he killed them, and it's monstrous.
But there were people in Rome who kind of raised eyebrows about this. But by and large, the reason that Caesar writes his commentaries and to frame the narrative is that he knows that people back in Rome want these kind of dramatic accounts of suffering and slaughter and endurance and ultimate triumph. Yeah. And it requires the slaughter and the enslavement of large numbers of people to demonstrate the quality of his heroism and to demonstrate to Rome that it has indeed triumphed over these kind of primordial and ancient enemies. And so, we do not have the equivalent of triumphs where people boast about how many people they've killed, how many people they've enslaved. And so, as the more I carried on writing about the ancient empires, the more this kind of niggled me. And I increasingly came to feel that essentially what had changed, certainly morally and ethically, is that Christianity essentially rewires the brain. But also
rewires the brain.
It rewires the brain. It rewires the moral, the ethical assumptions that govern people. Yeah. So that what the Romans assumed to be human nature and what we assume to be human nature is radically different. But more than that, that our assumptions about almost every aspect of human existence gets rewired as well. And what
so we have a different idea about what human nature is than the antiques.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, but it's on the most fundamental level. It's kind of you'd think that sexual desire is something that's kind of constant. Everyone, but again, it gets wholly reconfigured. That our idea of time, the Romans had a kind of essentially a cyclical idea of time. We have it begins with Genesis, it will end with Revelation.
A linear.
Yeah, and so in Harlem, I was going to see an exhibition of paleo art of the illustrations of prehistoric life beginning in the early 19th century, when of course people, it was this kind of great discovery that the world was much older than the Bible seemed to imply. And this is usually framed as a great challenge to Christianity, that the discovery of deep time and biblical history is seen as antithetical. But actually, I don't think so, because I think, and without that sense of time as an arrow, having a start, having a finish, conceptually, people in the early 19th century would not have been able to think of these strange bones that they were finding as belonging to creatures that had existed long before. So it's on that most kind of fundamental level. And if you like, that's the kind of equivalent of the radioactivity leak reaching Amsterdam. It's kind of fading, but it's still, the source is pretty clear, I think.
Mm-hmm. And because so you're actually saying that the idea of at least not trying to kill all your enemies and being kind to enemies is totally foreign to empires before sort of the coming of Christ or the coming of the church?
There are certainly people in. Cato, Caesar's enemy, thinks that Caesar should be handed over to the Germans for betraying an oath, but there's a kind of element of politics
but he's an
about
enemy
that. So it's
he,
not grounded in a kind of fundamental vision. And again, I think it lies in a story, and it lies in the poetry and the symbolism of perhaps the key story in the Christian Bible, which is the story of the Passion and the Resurrection. And what Christianity does is to say that the cross, which is a kind of emblematic symbol of Roman power, it's a symbol of the right of a governor to put to death anybody who opposes Roman power. He has the right to burn people, he has the right to throw them to the beasts, he has the right to crucify them.
Yeah, and that's a real torture, because people might not know this, but that is, you're not dying immediately. It's a long,
which is why it's worse than being burnt or being torn to pieces by lions, because it's not just that it's physically agonizing. It's not just that you can't beat off the birds that are pecking at your eyes or attacking your genitals. It's that all this suffering is public and protracted. And in a society where dignity is of the essence, this kind of humiliating, protracted death, this death agony, is something that is seen as being paradigmatically the fate of slaves. So it's the worst fate, the most humiliating fate, the most socially degrading fate that you could possibly have.
Yeah, in the first chapter of the book, you write about these sort of tortures, about the Greeks doing it to a Persian nobleman at the rim of Europe, at the Bosporus, and you describe also the tortures the Persian kings do to their. I mean, I truly recommend reading the book. I mean, it's really amazing. But you have to stomach the first two chapters. The torture is just.
And it begins with an account of crucifixion. And the reason for that, it didn't originally, but I was about 2 chapters into writing it when I went.
It's gripping, though.
I went to Iraq to make a film about the Islamic State.
Yeah.
And I was in this shattered town where women had been enslaved, and men
Yazidi
had been
women,
and men had been slaughtered and crucified.
Sinjar, yeah.
And I'd read a lot about crucifixion. I'd read a lot about Roman power. I'd read a lot about how it was a given in antiquity that if you resist a Roman army, or any ancient army, then your women are liable to enslavement, and your men are liable to be slaughtered and tortured to death. But to be in a town that had been flattened, where bones still lay scattered around, and where the people who'd done this were kind of lying a mile or so away, absolutely within striking distance, and to know that people had been crucified opened this kind of great kind of sense of moral, maybe even spiritual desolation, because I realized how terrifying I found a world in which the cross did not have the signification that it has for us, even if you're not a a believing Christian, if you see a white van with a red cross pull up, you know that this is good news. The cross is a symbol of the fact that, in a sense, the weak will triumph over the strong, that the powerless have a kind of authority over the powerful, and to think that the cross might not have this significance, that it might be an emblem of what it was for the Romans.
Of terror.
The power of the strong to torture and intimidate.
Of terror, a symbol of
Yeah,
terror.
so I felt this kind of incredible sense of gnawing dread in my guts. I mean, I'm not a kind of naturally brave person. And I found it a kind of profound experience. So I came back and rewrote that. So I do think the weirdness of that is really, really important. Now,
the weirdness of, wait a moment, because we're dwelling on this because it's a Roman way of torturing the slaves and making you, making you in public suffer. So your dignity is gone. Your physical body is tortured. Even your spiritual dignity is gone because it's in public, and that fate is suffered by the Christian prophet. No?
He's not a prophet, though, is he? I mean, and that's the weirdness of it, because the earliest person who we know who writes about it is Paul.
Yeah.
And Paul says he's it's not a prophet. It's the God of Israel, who has also created the entire universe.
Yeah.
So it's the strangeness. So Paul says that this is this idea that the God of Israel, and Paul isn't entirely sure quite what the relationship is between the Son and the Father. I mean, this is lots to discuss.
Yeah.
But his vague idea that in some way the God of Israel has died this monstrous death
on the cross.
and he says, this is a stumbling block to the Jews, which is putting it mildly. I mean, it's a massive stumbling block. And then he says, and it's madness to the Gentiles, by which he means essentially the Romans. And
the non-Jews.
Absolutely, it's a stumbling block to the Romans. And it's not a stumbling block, the idea that a human can become a god, because this is part of the air of what the Romans breathe. And in fact, the fastest growing
Caesars become gods.
Fastest growing cult of the first century AD is not Christianity. It's the cult of Augustus, who is the son of a god. Julius Caesar has been deified. He is the son of a god. He's Divi Filius. He has brought peace to the world. He's brought, a reign of peace. The swords have been beaten into plowshares.
So man becoming gods is sort of in the air.
Not an issue. And then he's, when he dies, he ascends to heaven. He sits at the right hand of his Father. So all this stuff is kind of, it's not that odd.
It's the same
but
narrative.
The oddness is the fact that it's this guy who's died the death of a slave. That's the strangeness, and that's the weirdness of it.
And that's part of the rewiring, because it is a God, so the highest principle, the Logos, the God who shaped the world, who actually made the world, who is the world, who's in the world, who dies on the cross and suffers the fate of a slave.
Yes, and in the early, so Paul clearly feels this is weird, this is shocking, this is terrible.
Yeah.
Yes, I admit this is such a kind of mad thing to be saying. And still in the 2nd century, you get Christians who say, yeah, this is a terrible thing. This is what we believe. We believe this. And even after Constantine converts, and he sees a cross in the sky.
And by that he wins the battle.
Yes.
Yeah?
But a century on, it's only then that we start to get Christians portraying the cross. It's almost as though they can't bring themselves, they can write about it, but they can't bring themselves to portray it. It's so awful. And when you do start to get images of Christ on the cross, he's portrayed as an athlete. He's buff, he's toned, he's got a kind of athlete's loincloth. He's victorious. He's run in the race and he's won the palm.
Yeah, he's also a Apollonian figure.
Yes.
Figure, yeah.
And it's only with the first millennium that you start to get images of Jesus dead on the cross.
But why do you think it's so essential and it's so telling, and you explain that very well in your book, but why do you think it's so telling that he suffers the sort of the worst kind of fate? What's so weird about that? What's so essential about that?
It's the sense of contrast between the God of Israel is not just any God. He is God. There is only the one God. So the sense of the fall, the sense of the humiliation, the sense of the humbling, and therefore the sense of the love is stupefying to people who accept that this is what actually happened.
Yeah.
It's something overwhelming. And because this man who has been crucified under the power of Caesar on an implement of torture that is representative of the right of the greatest power in the world to manifest itself, that power is kind of subverted. And it intrudes upon every conqueror, every king, every magistrate condemning a criminal to death who is a Christian, a kind of nagging anxiety that people previously had not had. And that anxiety is that actually those who suffer, those who are poor, those who are slaves, those who are criminals, might in some way be closer to God than the rich and the powerful. Now, human nature being what it is, this doesn't stop kings from being kingly, and it doesn't stop magistrates from condemning people to death, and it doesn't stop the rich from exulting in their riches. But it introduces a kind of an anxiety that will run like a kind of psychic flame through the civilization that emerges out of the rubble of Roman power in the West, and indeed in the East. But let's talk about the West, because it's in the West that it takes on its peculiarly transformative effect. And by the 11th century, it's starting to, which is the period when you start to see Christ dead on the cross, Christ suffering on the cross. And it starts to feed into an idea that that earthly greatness can and should be humbled in the cause of the service of God. And so you see, emperors kneeling in the snow. You see kings whipped through the streets of their own cities in the cause of affirming an idea that there is a kind of sovereign way of structuring God's purpose on earth that is greater than that of earthly kings. Now,
so God is siding with the beggars and the lepers instead of with the gods of the ancients who are siding with the kings and the rich that's sort of the turn you're describing, isn't it? It's
yes, it's a crucial part of it, but of course it comes hedged about by paradox and ambivalence and ambiguity, because almost everything to do with Christianity is a kind of paradox. I don't know if you've read a comic English science fiction novel called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in which there is a spaceship that is powered by paradox. And Christianity is basically a spaceship that is powered through time by paradox. So the paradox. Let's look at the 11th century when what happens is that the Pope who humbles the emperor at Canossa.
Yeah.
He is doing this in the name of Christ, who likewise is seen as having humbled emperors. And this idea that light has to be brought into darkness fuses with an idea that the church has to be rendered pure of the taint of the earthly. And this enables people who've seized the commanding heights of the Roman Church to push through something again that is wholly unprecedented. And that is the idea that's been a constant from Japan to the Atlantic across Eurasia, that if you're an earthly ruler, you're an earthly autocrat, then you have a right to poke your nose into the affairs of the supernatural as well, the dimension. And whether you're in Japan, whether in China, whether you're in India or Islamic world or Byzantium. What's happening at Canossa is the Pope is saying, actually, earthly king, no, back off. There is a purity, there is a sovereignty in the church that is greater than yours. You belong to the flux of what Christian theologians call the saeculum. The saeculum meaning the flux of things, what will rise, what will pass. Yeah. We in the church are the guardians of the religio, the bond between fallen man caught up in the saeculum and the eternity of the city of God. And the only way that this will work is if you back off. And so this is framed in terms that draw on this kind of idea that the humbling of Christ, that's his greatness, and it's greater than the power of any earthly king, and that's why Henry IV it has to be humiliated and humbled, and it's why when new institutions are planted that come to be called universities, the impulse behind this is a desire to find ways of structuring this new kind of sovereign idea of the church. And the lawyers look at the canons and they look at the decrees of the popes, but they also look at scripture, and they start to formulate an idea that if as Christ has said, the rich have a duty to care for the poor, then surely the poor have a right to what the rich are giving. Surely the poor have a right to food, to drink, to clothing, to shelter. And so this kind of radical idea that the poor as well have what will come to be called rights starts to bed itself down. Now, so far I'm aware that I've given a very eulogistic account of Christianity. But, of course, there are, as I've said, there are paradoxes here. And part of the paradox is that this transformative way of seeing the world, which is founded on the idea that that empire is something to be overthrown, that a slave crucified by an empire is in some way God, nevertheless wishes to extend its power across the entire world. And Christ has spoken of his kingdom not being of this earth. And yet, as it turns out, the church and Christians who are enthused by this new vision of the church are actually quite keen on drawing their sword and extending their power. So this idea that the world needs to be purified leads to Christian soldiers sailing, marching all the way to Jerusalem and drowning the streets of Jerusalem in blood. And in due course, as this kind of you have armed warriors who feel pledged to put to the sword those who are the enemies of this Prince of Peace who died on the cross. And you also have emerging cadres of lawyers and intellectuals who come to regard those who are left behind as deplorables, if you like. People, for instance, who live around Albi are people who are not accepting the latest cutting-edge views of scholars trained in Paris or Bologna. And so they have to be put to the sword. And then on top of that, there are people who feel that this hasn't gone far enough, and that the radicals, the revolutionaries, have become the new elite. So the process of what these revolutionaries have been calling reformatio, the remaking of the world, needs to be pushed even further, and they too come to be persecuted. So the paradox is that a revolutionary new way of seeing the world that has this image of a man tortured to death on a cross, and over the course of the Middle Ages, the portrayal of these tortures becomes more and more vivid, more and more unsettling, nevertheless ends up inflicting tortures on people in defense of a particular understanding of what this cross means.
Yeah, so it's, but you're saying, among many things, that that the division of the religio and the secular is something which is driven by the church. So it's not the worldly kings. Yes. It's coming out of the church, this division, and the division is a new revolutionary thing around the year 1000, which shapes the modern world in many ways.
Yes, and so it's drawing on all the elements of theology that talked about, but it's also drawing on something else in Paul's letters, which is a kind of radical new way of understanding what the proper relationship of men and women are.
We're gonna. I'm glad you mentioned it, because we're going to go back to Paul of Tarsus. It's one of the main characters in your book, actually.
Well, he's the only one who gets an entire chapter.
Yeah. I noted that actually, if I read it well, that the opponent of Paul of Tarsus is Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, in the way you constructed the book. Is that right? Do you see them as mirror images or enemies or black and white? Or
it's fabulous. You're the first person to have noticed that that they are the bookends, that Paul, with his saying that Christ's death on the cross is a scandal, appears in chapter 3, and Nietzsche, who says something very similar, appears in the 3rd chapter from the end. It's a very kind of deliberate structure.
I was wondering. Okay.
So Paul and Nietzsche are the kind of the two bookends, and the thing about Nietzsche is that by the end of the 19th century, people have become desensitized to the strangeness of Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
Everyone just accepts it.
We're going to come to Nietzsche because the last third of the book is, well, not even, but it's. We're going to come to Nietzsche, but first we have to establish a little bit more about Paul, about why Christianity and Christendom is so influential in the way we think. We've spoken about Christ suffering on the cross and how revolutionary that is, and how repulsive actually to the antiques, and how new and revolutionary that in many ways is. There are two more things I want to dwell upon. Why? And we have asked Maureen Taven to prepare two more texts. One is about one we'd like to listen to now. It's a brief of it's the letter of Paul of Tarsus to the Galatians, and we're going to listen to it first and maybe talk about it a little bit more. Please, Maureen.
O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified? Let me ask you only this: did you receive the Spirit by works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Are you so foolish? Having begun with the Spirit, are you now ending with the flesh? Did you experience so many things in vain, if it really is in vain? Does he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you do so by works of the law, or by hearing with faith? Thus Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So you see that it is men of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, "In you shall all the nations be blessed." So then, those who are men of faith are blessed with Abraham, who had faith. For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, "Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law and do them." Now it is evident that no man is justified before God by the law. For he who through faith is righteous shall live. But the law does not rest on faith. For he who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed be everyone who hangs on a tree." That in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles, that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. To give a human example, brethren, no one annuls even a man's will or adds to it once it has been ratified. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, which is Christ. This is what I mean. The law, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. For if the inheritance is by the law, it is no longer by promise. But God gave it to Abraham by a promise. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. And it was ordained by angels through an intermediary. Now, an intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. Is the law then against the promises of God? Certainly not. For if a law had been given which could make alive, then righteousness would indeed be by the law. But the Scripture consigned all things to sin, that what was promised to faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe. Now, before faith came, we were confined under the law, kept under restraint until faith should be revealed. So that the law was our custodian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a custodian. For in Jesus Christ, you are all sons of God, through faith. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, as according to promise.
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen.
That's right.
Can we have not the last sentence, but the one before that? Can we put it up again for one moment, please? Is that possible? Anyway, it's the the one after this one. Yeah. We chose this passage, of course, because of this sentence. It's a brief of Paul of Tarsus to the Galatians. Galatians. What's the English word? Galatians. And we have and you dwell on this quite long in the book. We've spoken about the Lord, God suffering on the cross, but this is his first disciple, or sort of, and the founder of the Christian faith, Paul, in many ways, and he writes to this newly founded churches. The man went all over the Mediterranean to found churches, which is totally amazing, and made possible by the Roman roads and the Roman peace and the Roman ships and the Roman shipping, and
like the internet now, created by the CIA to serve American interests, has served many people who may not entirely be complicit with American power. So,
exactly. Yes. So the Romans laid out these wonderful roads, and Paul of Tarsus went over those roads, and he must have been an impressive man to sort of all where he came, make churches. And congregations of people who believed. Amazing. Like you say, amazing things of God suffering on a cross.
I remember when I was a boy and we'd have a Bible reading from the Old Testament, a Bible reading from the New, and then a Bible reading from the Gospel. And the Old Testament was usually quite interesting. It might involve kings being killed or tent pegs being driven through people's heads, quite fun. The Gospel, you might get a good parable or something.
A bit of wine.
Usually the New Testament reading was one of Paul's letters, and I would just switch off. I just think, wow, this is dreary. I have no idea what he's going on about at all. What's all this stuff about the law? Who cares? And it was only, the more I reflected on it, that I realized that actually Paul's letters are the most influential works of literature I think ever written, the most influential documents. And they are like a kind of, almost every line is like a kind of acorn from which enormous oaks have grown, and which we now kind of live under their spreading branches. And this passage is an acorn that has given rise to a vast number of oaks. And it kind of goes back to the idea that we were talking about earlier, that when Paul says that the crucifixion is a stumbling block to the Jews. And it's a stumbling block to the Jews because Paul is saying that Christ's love, Christ's sacrifice, has served to redeem all of humanity. It's out of love for all of humanity. And therefore a covenant has been established by God with all human beings whom he has created. And that, of course, means, well, what about the original covenant, which was, written down on tablets of stone and given to Moses? And Paul is basically saying we don't need that anymore, because now the law is written on the heart. And this is such a kind of weird thing for a Jew to be saying, that Paul actually uses...
Paul is Jewish.
Yes, Paul, of course, is a Jew. Yeah. And he reaches for a word that comes from the Greek Stoics. And the Stoics believe that the divine is in everybody, and therefore in every human being. And this spark of divine they call synodesis, which you might call conscience. And so Paul is saying basically that the Stoic idea of conscience is the law of God. And if you accept Christ, if you love Christ, if you open your heart to the Spirit, then you will find the law of God written on your heart. And this is something that is open to everyone. It is open to Greek and it is open to Jew. It is open to free, it is open to slave, it is open to man, it is open to woman. All are joined in this one covenant. Now, the implications of this for the future are seismic, because it means that in Christian civilization, unlike, say, in Islamic civilization, where Jews and Muslims believe that there is a body of law that has been given by God, which is kind of perfect. You don't need anything more than that. You can, of course, play with it. The rabbis of the Talmud do enormously. The scholars of the Sunnah do as well. But for Christians, what this beds down is the idea, firstly, that human law is something that can embody the will of God. So you don't need,
revelation.
But also that because you look into your heart and the Spirit progressively illumines it, therefore law can be progressive. So the idea that
law can change. Yeah,
so law can change, and it can approximate better and better and better over the course of time. And this, of course, again, is a really crucial idea, that the idea that society, law, people's understanding of what is right can improve over time. The idea that to be progressive is a positive is something that goes back to these letters. So that we might say, yeah, that's a positive. But there is also a shadow to this, which is embedded in that phrase, there is no Jew nor Greek. Now, this is the underpinning of Western universalism, the Western universalism that we have today. This idea, and again, that is echoing the idea that you get in Genesis, that God has created every human being in his image across the entire globe.
Equal.
Yes, and equal. Yeah. And so this is picking that up and running with it and saying that it doesn't matter whether you're black or white, whatever. We're all equal. And of course, this again is a fundamental moral principle that we still uphold to this day. It's kind of what underpins our ideals as society. But
the universal rights of man.
There is a problem. Because if you're a Jew and you're being told there is no Jew or Greek, you might turn around and say, I don't want my distinctiveness as a Jew to be dissolved into a kind of universal mush. And that is actually what most Jews say. To Paul's enormous disappointment, most of his fellow Jews do not accept Christ as Lord. They want to remain Jewish. And so right from the very beginning, the very earliest Christian texts we have, this is an issue, a problem for Christian universalism. What do you do with people who may not want to be a part of the universal? And so what we were talking about with reference to heretics, with reference to pagans, with reference to Muslims, of course, paradigmatically is true as well of the Jews. And so the history of Christianity's relationship to the Jews is also a fundamental part of this story.
And also, because this is also the fundament in many ways to that there is no, this is quite revolutionary. There's neither slave nor free.
In Christ Jesus.
Yeah.
So
if you believe in him. Yeah.
Yeah. But as I say, these are acorns that will take quite a long time to grow, because this is not saying slavery should be abolished.
No.
But it is saying that there is a kind of moral equality, that all are created equal, that over the centuries and over the millennia, like a kind of depth charge, that the ripples from that kind of single detonation will ripple out in ways that over the course of time will kind of bring a lot of towers tumbling down. Essentially, this is one of the phrases that the whole of Western civilization is built on. But it's the equivalent, it's the equivalent of the San Andreas Fault.
Yeah.
So Western civilization is like San Francisco. Every so often,
it shakes.
It's going to shake. Things are going to come down. You're going to have to rebuild.
Yes, because and you pointed out very well in the book as well, because the coming of the universal idea of Christianity, which is a universalist idea, that's also why you call it dominion. It's universal, brings with it the divisions: who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah. And what do you do with people who are wrong?
Yeah, what do you do? And that you normally kill them.
Yes. Well, not always.
Not necessarily, but often.
Not necessarily. You might. Yeah. The earliest example we have of a Christian leader basically losing patience with people who refuse to accept the peace of Christ is Charlemagne.
Yeah,
who is, Boniface goes into the forest of Saxony and chops down a tree to try and make his point. When this doesn't work, Charlemagne launches a full-out war of conquest, which involves an enormous amount of slaughter. And Alcuin, his kind of conscience, if you like, his synodesis,
his minister
says,
of education.
Whoa, hold on, I'm not sure that this should be happening. And that articulates a kind of dialogue within Christianity that reappears over and over again. It's there when the Spanish go to America, and you get people like Las Casas saying, if God has created all of human beings, then these Indians have rights as well, and we shouldn't be doing this. And I think that you get it. I think the Gulf War is a kind of illustration of that. For Bush, it was about spreading a kind of universalist idea. He's a devout Christian, but I think he thinks that the values he holds are authentically universal, and he believes that as passionately as any medieval pope or any conquistador. And likewise, people, who demonstrated, who opposed the war, were like Alcuin, kind of saying, "Oh, I'm not sure whether we should bomb people into accepting our values like this." And this is a dialogue that's been going on and on and on.
Yeah. Yeah.
What matters more, to bring people into the light of Christ, or to bring people into the light of kind of universalism, or to bring people into a proper liberal attitude, or what do you do?
We haven't talked about, before I come back to Friedrich Nietzsche and the ending of the book, we have one more fragment to listen to, which it's Augustine, St. Augustine's sermon on John 6, and we've chosen it because you probably know it's the motto of the book. and it says, love and do as you will, St. Augustine. That's the motto of the book. And that's a third aspect of the book and maybe of the coming of Christendom we want to talk about. Please, Maureen.
Yes, thank you. All who do not love God are strangers and antichrists. They might come to the churches, but they cannot be numbered among the children of God. That fountain of life does not belong to them. A bad person can have baptism and prophecy. King Saul had prophecy. Even while he persecuted the holy David, he was filled with the spirit of prophecy and began to prophesy. A bad person can receive the sacrament of the body and blood of the Lord. For it is said, all who eat and drink unworthily eat and drink judgment on themselves. A bad person can have the name of Christ and be called a Christian. Such people are referred to when it says, they polluted the name of their God. To have all these sacraments is, as I say, possible even for a bad person. But to have love and be a bad person is impossible. Love is the unique gift, the fountain that is yours alone. The Spirit of God exhausts you to drink from it, and in so doing, to drink from himself.
Thank you. It's the motto of the book, and there's a whole part on the Beatles.
Yeah, all you need is love.
All you need is love.
Yeah.
Is this so crucial to? So crucial that it's the motto of the book?
Well, you could see some of the again, the paradox is there.
Yeah.
Augustine is writing about the importance of love, but he's saying people who don't love are kind of antichrists.
Yeah.
So love people or I'll kill you is again a kind of running paradox that goes through Christian history, and I think that. When the Beatles sang All You Need Is Love, they did it as part of a satellite link-up. It was the very first global satellite link-up, so people across the world would do it.
Out of every road.
They did that. They said this was Britain's contribution, the Beatles singing All You Need Is Love. And the Beatles sang it because they assumed that this was a given, that everyone would accept that all you need is love, what's wrong with that? But actually, it's reflective of again, deeply Christian assumptions that the Beatles, even though John Lennon had famously said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, they'd all been raised in kind of Christian assumptions. They'd all just absorbed it. This is kind of the radioactivity idea. It was just kind of part of what they were.
They just assumed that everybody would.
And they sing this in 1967, which is remembered as the Summer of Love. And I think that in 100 years' time, the Summer of Love and the 60s will be seen as a decade as crucial to the history of Christian civilization as the 1520s and 30s were. So the decade that sees the kind of explosion of the Reformation. And I think that the 60s is
the
a kind of
1520s. You mean when Martin Luther?
Yes, and I mean, it may seem a kind of big claim to make, but if you think about the scale of the moral, the ethical transformation that's happened, in 1950, homosexuality was illegal across much of the West. Now it's illegal to be opposed to Christianity, pretty much. And
To
so
oppose
that's,
to homosexuality.
and so that's a really profound transformation. And this is often seen as expressive of a kind of really profound repudiation of Christianity, kind of society, the West's final emancipation from Christianity. But predictably, maybe I see it in slightly different terms, another paradox, that this is actually just another convulsion, this process of reformatio, whereby patterns of behavior, the desire to remake the world in the name of love, generates kind of explosive effects. That the 60s is another kind of shaking of the San Andreas fault, if you like. And the pre-tremor of the 60s is the civil rights movement in America.
Martin Luther King Jr.
And this is happening against the backdrop of the Second World War and the Nazis. And the Nazis are the first political regime since Constantine consciously to repudiate certain fundamental Christian values. So unlike the French Revolution, unlike the Russian Revolution, which affirms the idea that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, that the weak have a moral quality that is greater than that of the strong, and also are profoundly universalist, that there is no Jew or Greek. These are principles that the French and the Russian revolutionaries absolutely uphold. The Nazis, of course, do not. The Nazis completely think that the first should remain first and the last possibly should be eliminated. And they certainly don't think that there is no Jew or Greek. They think that, they're so opposed to that idea that they end up trying to wipe the Jews out. And in the wake of that, the shock is felt in Europe and the United States so profoundly that I think it effectively, it means in a way that you almost don't need confessional Christianity anymore. Because if you want to know, as someone born in the West, what is the right thing to do, you no longer need to look at the figure of Jesus. You no longer need the church or the Bible. All you have to do is to look at the Nazis and say, well, we will do whatever the opposite is. It's still a kind of Christianity. I mean, it's a shadowy form of Christianity because the Nazis offend us because they have offended against these fundamental Christian dictates, which have been part of Western assumptions for 2,000 years. But you don't need overt Christianity. And so this is part of the flux that will emerge in the 60s. But the other is that in the 50s, Martin Luther King, who is a Baptist, who speaks with the cadences of the Bible, he summons white Americans to recognize their kinship with black Americans. If there is no Jew or Greek, then there is no black or white. And he does this in the name of a savior who he says is an extremist for love. And the fact that this is happening, a decade or so after the opening of the death camps in Europe means that it has a kind of peculiar moral urgency. And so the civil rights movement basically succeeds. And it's yet another example of the way in which Christianity serves to reform society. It's another iteration of reformatio. And you might think that this shows that in the wake of the Second World War, that confessional Christianity, institutional Christianity, will continue as it has always done, like a kind of Catherine wheel, throwing out these sparks, and that will be the main focus of the West. But what actually happens is something slightly different, which is that other groups of people take up the model of what Martin Luther King has done with race, and does it with gender and with sexuality. So you get feminism and you get gay rights campaigners. And for confessional Christians in the United States, this is more unsettling because they can entirely accept that there should be no black or white. This is, from Genesis through to Galatians, this is really fundamental. But they have been taught that in the marriage between a man and a woman, a man should be the head and have the headship over woman. And so the claims of women to an equality with men, they find unsettling. And even more, the idea that homosexuals should have an equality with heterosexuals, because they know that Paul, in his letter to the Romans, has said, condemns the fact that Roman men sleep with men and that Roman women sleep with women. And so over the course of the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s, and now right the way into the present, what has happened is a sense of a widening fracture between confessional Christians and people who you might define as progressives, liberals, secularists, whatever. And feminism and gay rights have been the kind of battering rams that have seemed to widen this division. But it's more complicated than that. And it's more complicated I think, in two fundamental ways. The first is that the inspiration for both these movements is clearly the civil rights movement. And it's accepted because enough men accept the justice of feminism, enough heterosexuals accept the justice of gay rights campaigners. And they do that because the idea that actually a kind of, we should love one another, and that those who have been downtrodden should be raised up, and that those who've been last should be first, remains part of the air that we breathe. And so people accept the fundamental justice of this. The other reason is that actually, although Paul says that that the man is like Christ in a marriage and that the woman is like the church, and that might seem massively sexist to our eyes, in fact, by the standards of Roman sexuality, this is radically liberating. To a Roman, what matters is that you are free and a citizen and male and powerful, and then you can do whatever you like to anyone else. Yeah. Anyone else. And Paul is saying, no, this is not acceptable. Men have to exercise continence, and you have to respect women's bodies because they have kind of a bodily integrity. A woman's body is her own. And if you are a Christian, you can't just go around shagging the scullery maid or the page boy or whatever. It's unacceptable. So that sense of the dignity of the female body, which is a crucial part of feminism, I think, again, it's one of these oaks that has sprung from the acorns that are lying around in Paul's letters.
In Paul's letters, yeah.
And so also is the very concept and category of homosexuality, because those two lines that I mentioned, Paul saying in a kind of almost throwaway way to the Romans that there are men who sleep with men and that there are women who sleep with women. This, as far as I know, is the only passage in ancient literature that posits the idea of kind of same-sex attraction as a distinctive category. Of course, the Romans understand that there are men who like women and men who like men, but for them it's kind of like, you like blondes or you like brunettes. It's a kind of interesting foible, but it's not fundamental. And likewise, of course, in the Mosaic law, there are penalties against men sleeping with men, but it's not framed as being same-sex attraction. It's a kind of specific sex act that a man does with another male. So that Pauline category, again, is something, it's another of these acorns. It's something very, very radical and original. And the measure of how radical is that it takes 1,000 years, really, before a name is invented which kind of approximates to it. And that name is sodomy, which derives from a teaching of Gregory the Great in the 6th century that the sin of Sodom, which gets wiped out by the anger of God, was same-sex relations, even though there's no evidence for that in Genesis at all. And Aquinas in the 13th century, in his kind of great philosophical magnum opus, says that yes, sodomy is men sleeping with men, women sleeping with women. But it still remains a very unstable category. Right the way into the 19th century, sodomy can mean masturbation or bestiality or a man having anal sex with a woman. I mean, it can mean a whole host of different things. And it's really only with the Darwinian idea that sex has an evolutionary purpose that you get people who start to look at sexuality in a scientific way. And the key person who does this is a German-Austrian psychologist called Kraft-Ebing. And he is a devout Catholic, but he's also a scientist. And so he takes up this word that in German is coined in the 1860s, and he popularizes it in a whole host of European languages. And for Kraft-Ebing, a homosexual is someone who is, it's not like sodomy. sodomy is an act, homosexuality is a condition, and this is what he starts to in his secupathia sexualis, this is how he defines it. But the publication of this means that he gets written to by lots of people who come to define themselves as homosexual. They're grateful for this kind of neologism, this novel description. And they say to him, so glad you understand me. I want what men and women have. I want a stable relationship. So what they are wanting is the equivalent of a Christian marriage, Christian monogamous relationship. And Krafft-Ebing is sufficiently a Catholic that by he comes to see homosexuality as basically being a fusion of the Christian sin of sodomy and the Christian virtue of monogamous love and marriage. And this becomes the moment it gets kind of introduced into the bloodstream of Christian Europe, everyone accepts it for granted, together with the equally radical notion of heterosexuality. And then it spreads very rapidly. So it's one of the most influential Christian categorizations that's ever been coined. So,
again,
in the Muslim world, in China, everywhere, people kind of accept it. So in the 60s, when you start to get gay liberation, the challenge for Christians is, what are you emphasizing? Are you emphasizing the sin, or are you emphasizing the love?
Yeah.
And again, it's not a coincidence that legislation for gay marriage has happened, I think, almost entirely exclusively in Christian majority countries, because the very notion of homosexuality is one that has sprung from this Christian seedbed.
You're saying that the idea of secularization of the idea of love, like the Beatles bring it, is another transformation of the whole Christian categories or way of thinking, but
kind of. I mean, I think that the way in which the 60s is a kind of repudiation of Christianity is manifest in that idea of the summer of love.
Yeah.
Because for Martin Luther King, love is what it is for Luther and for Paul and Augustine and Luther. It's a spiritual love. But of course, for the Beatles, and particularly, say, for the Rolling Stones or Jim Morrison, love is all about shagging groupies. Yeah. And in the summer of love, there's a kind of radical sense that actually Christian sexual morality is repressive and uptight, and the idea that Christians are like blue meanies coming along and stopping hippies from having their fun.
Yeah.
And the idea beds down over the course of the 70s, and I guess Amsterdam is a kind of paradigmatic illustration of that. This Calvinist city that suddenly decided, we're going to have a massive red light district and prostitution, woohoo! And this becomes an index of Amsterdam's liberal character. This is the most liberal city in the world. You can wander around and see prostitutes standing in windows, woohoo! And so as I was writing the book, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to have to acknowledge that is a real repudiation of Christian sexual ethics. But then as I was writing it, the Harvey Weinstein affair broke in America. And what nobody asked about that was, well, what's the big issue? Why shouldn't a powerful man sexually use his subordinates? And the reason nobody asks that is because we are so saturated in Christian assumptions that the very idea that the Romans had, that a powerful man has this right, is something that's become anathema to us.
It's rewired,
and
like
so
you said in the beginning.
And so the Me Too movement works because men accept it.
Yeah. But last part of the conversation, you just said that indeed you constructed the book between Paul of Tarsus and Friedrich Nietzsche, because Nietzsche is very, very. I mean, he declares that God is dead, and God has been murdered, or he's no longer there, and he hates Christ.
He's okay with Christ. Even Nietzsche doesn't go so far as to diss Christ too badly.
Well,
but who he really disses is Paul.
Yeah, Paul of Tarsus, but
Hitler does as well.
As Hitler does as well, and that's interesting because you're writing here that that Nietzsche says, you're quoting Nietzsche that he says, well, if God's dead, then we have a real problem with morality. Then there's no morality anymore, and then the book goes on into the Third Reich and to the Nazis, who, like you just said before, who take actually the the Christian faith very seriously in the respect that they think it's the opposite of what they want. So they,
Yeah.
so they, and you seem to say there that where does this Christian faith come from, which helps the poor and thinks that the weak are an example to the strong and should be held upon to shown. Where does it come from? Of course, from the Jews. So the Jews need to be killed.
Yeah, and I've been talking about Christianity as a history of paradoxes,
Yeah.
and I think this is the most grotesque paradox in the whole of Christian history.
So in many ways, the Nazis are taking Paul of Tarsus and Jesus Christ very, very serious as their enemies, as their real enemies.
You see, even the
want.
Nazis can't bring themselves to diss Jesus, so they're quite keen on the idea that Jesus was an Aryan, that perhaps he was the son of a Germanic centurion or someone. So they give Jesus a kind of honorary Aryan status. But they have no doubt that Paul is a Jew. So he's always the Paul Jew, the Jew Paul. And Hitler in particular is very anxious about this because Hitler sees both the Greeks and the Romans as being of Nordic stock. Hitler has no time for kind of Himmler's obsession with digging up crap German pots, which don't measure up at all. Hitler is into the Parthenon and Augustus, and in fact, Hitler is so obsessed by Augustus that in 1938, when it's the 2000th anniversary of Augustus's birth, and Mussolini puts on a great exhibition in Rome, he goes 3 times to see it, which Hitler doesn't really like travelling very much. It's quite something, and Hitler says, well, what went wrong with the Greeks? What went wrong with the Romans? And he says basically they got corrupted by Paul. Paul turns up, this Jew,
by the Jew.
and and Paul's teachings is like a cancer that rotted the ferocity, the cruelty, the power, the authority of the Greeks, of the Romans, their commitment to racial purity, their emphasis on strength. And this is kind of bastardized Nietzscheism because, of course, Nietzsche hates Christianity because it praises the weak, because it gives the weak a power over the strong. That's what he hates, and that's kind of what Hitler hates about it as well. And so Paul teaches that a man who died on a cross is somehow God, and therefore there is strength in weakness, and this is a cancer. And Paul also teaches, as we saw, that there is no Jew or Greek, and this is massively a cancer because Jews and Greeks have to be kept apart. And so when Hitler talks about founding a 1,000-year Reich, which of course is an echo of Revelation, the idea, that's what. So there are certainly, even in the Nazis, there are Christian echoes, and of course it's drawing on anti-Semitic traditions within Christianity as well. But fundamentally, Hitler sees Christianity as proof of what the Jews at their most dangerous can do. And if his Reich is to last 1,000 years, unlike Greece, unlike Rome, then they have to get rid of the Jews. Because if they don't, someone like Paul will emerge and destroy the Reich from within. And it's the most horrible paradox that the Jews get killed because Hitler blames them for Christianity. And on that bombshell.
On that wonderful, we could have talked about communism as a new way of reinterpreting the Christian values. We could have talked about many, many other things. We could have talked about enlightenment. We could have, the book is an endless source of conversation. And you've done your utmost best to shed some light on it. Thank you very, very much for all your talking and your thoughts. There might be anybody who is willing to join in the conversation or have a question. A question is a question and not a long expose. It has a question mark at the end of the first sentence. Let's see whether there's anybody who wants to join in. I see somebody over here. Yes. I will hold it for you
Tom,
to make sure it's one sentence.
Okay, I'm ready. How do you account for the fact that the German army used the Christian cross, a barely redesigned Malteser cross, the Balkenkreuz, which is just a sans serif version of the Malteser cross in typographical terms? How do you account for that?
Thank you.
Himmler hated Christianity even more than Hitler, and he set himself when the Nazis had won the war. He'd planned out a 40 or 50-year program, essentially to eradicate everything within Christianity that he despised and hated. But the Nazis were content to have a kind of Christianity that would sustain and support the Reich and the principles of fascism. And so to that end, they were happy, for instance, to sponsor Lutherans, perhaps, who might emphasize the more anti-Semitic elements of Luther's own pronouncements on the Jews. And in fact, they convened a conference in the Wartburg where Luther had translated the New Testament into German, where they effectively disposed of the Old Testament from the biblical canon. And this was a temptation that had been there almost from the beginnings of Christianity, because in the 2nd century there was a Christian called Marcion who had proposed that the God who was the father of Christ could not have been the God of the Old Testament, and therefore that the Old Testament should be got rid of. And again, the Nazis are interested in this idea, and they're interested in a Christianity that's been purged of its Jewish elements. In the book, I mentioned in the talk I gave at the beginning that I talked about Tolkien and the Second World War. And Tolkien is the prism through which, in the book, I discuss the Nazis and the Holocaust. And I was nervous about whether this, is this strong enough to bear this weight? But actually, Tolkien had fought in the Battle of the Somme opposite Hitler. Hitler had been on the other side. And his son was in the RAF in the war and had been, therefore, part of the air force that had flattened Hamburg and would flatten Dresden. And so Tolkien was very aware of the cruelties and the horrors of the early 20th century, and was also a devout Catholic. And The Lord of the Rings may seem to be about kind of fantasy of elves and hobbits and things, but it is a surprisingly, I think, profound meditation on the darkness that lay at the heart of European Christian civilization. And Tolkien was against the firebombing of Hamburg because he did not see the Germans as the enemy. He saw the evil that was in all human beings, and therefore within the RAF pilots as well. And so this is what he writes to his son, warning against it. And I think that the most vivid image I can give of what the Nazis planned for Christianity is that they wanted it to become like the ring wraiths were to Sauron. Corrupted, transformed, turned into servants of what the Nazis, of course, saw as the light, but by a Christian light would have been an utter darkness and an utter repudiation of everything it was. So the cross, the use of the cross is an attempt to, it's kind of like giving, the sons of man rings and turning them into wraiths and servants of the darkness.
Into the opposite, actually. Yeah. Over there, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Hi. I really enjoyed your metaphor of the acorns that Paul was spreading around the world. And I was wondering if you would take that metaphor and look at the trees that have sprung out of it. Could you foresee a scenario in which those trees would eventually die? And what would that look like?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question that Nietzsche posits. Nietzsche is contemptuous of the idea that effectively you can have Christian values and ethics if you've lost Christian belief. And he's contemptuous of most philosophers as just being priests. And he's contemptuous of humanists and socialists and communists likewise as essentially being Christians. Nietzsche wants a kind of a recognition that God is dead, that corpse is dead, and he doesn't want the flickering shadows to continue to play. But even Nietzsche didn't know what this would look like. And he says repeatedly that that when people discover that God is dead and they have to abandon Christian ethics and values and together with Christian belief, then great horrors will be thrown up and it will be transformative. And Nietzsche, of course, is writing that before the Nazis. So it's impossible to read those lines and not think about what was coming up, a few decades after Nietzsche's death. So when Nietzsche says that the corpse of God lies in the cave and is casting shadows, I think that the modern West's horror at Nazism is that shadow. We look at the Nazis and we do whatever the opposite of the Nazis do. That's how we get our kind of moral sense. But I think that the power of that is fading. And I think a large part of the kind of convulsions, moral convulsions that are afflicting the West, and the feeling that liberals in particular have, that actually, 10 years ago perhaps, liberals felt the world is going to be liberal. I don't think liberals feel that now. And so the challenge of justifying liberalism in a way that goes beyond saying that if you don't accept liberal precepts, then you're a Nazi, that's proving inadequate. And so I think that I can envisage three possible ways in which the West might evolve morally. The first is that actually it turns out that liberalism, that the kind of after effects of the 60s revolution are self-sustaining. That they're kind of like, go back to the metaphor of a rocket ship, that doctrinal Christianity was the kind of booster that got liftoff, and now it's escaped the atmosphere and it doesn't need that anymore, and it can discard it and it will just continue to go across space and everything will be fine, and it's got enough fuel to keep it going. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is, as Nietzsche said, that as Christian belief declines, so Christian ethics and morality will decline as well, and I don't think it will be Nazism, but elements of fascism will return, a kind of a way that privileges the power of the strong over the weak and the power of the group over the universal. And that the Christian assumption that the weak have a kind of moral claim on the strong, and that there is no Jew or Greek will go. And the West will become increasingly in hock to strong men and to nationalism and perhaps to ethno-nationalism. So that's another way it might go. And a third way is that, which I guess is I suppose where I've gone, the path I've taken, which is to, I've become more and more anxious about why it is that I believe what I believe, and the kind of cultural contingency of it. And I've followed the thread back, and it's taken me, to this, traced the origins of these oaks, and I find them in the kind of the acorns scattered in early Christianity. And I would basically, I'm very happy now to identify as Christian, because I think that it's a stronger way of upholding things that I believe than to say that I'm a liberal. And it may be that this is something that as Western power retreats, as it becomes more and more clear that things that liberals have assumed were universal are in fact not universal at all, but are bred of the specific circumstances of Christian history that perhaps people will go back to in the West to Christianity. And it's important to emphasize that although the narrative in the West is all about Christianity's decline, in a global scale it's not in decline at all. I mean, it's sweeping Africa, it's huge, planting large numbers across Asia. So Christianity retains its kind of incredible fire gust, its ability to spread across the world, but maybe that fire will reignite in the West. So those are three alternatives, I would guess.
Thank you. I think we're going to go for the two last questions. If we put them together, then.
I found really interesting what you thought about Jesus, how he was kind of humble, and that was kind of redefined, Western culture. So my question for you is, if we look at modern day Western culture, are there any leaders who have these, maybe you see some leaders that have the same qualities or the same possessions of character as Jesus?
No. No. And I don't think that there's ever... You see, what this book does not do is engage with the question of who the historical Jesus was. And it's a huge relief, because this is the kind of bog of bogs. I had some experience of how treacherous these grounds can be when I wrote about who I thought the historical Muhammad was. Jesus is even more difficult in a way. But what I do think about the figure of Jesus in the four canonical Gospels is that if they do not reflect a real person, if they do not hold a mirror up to the historical Jesus, then he is the most astonishing fictional character ever created. Because imagine the commission you would have to give these four not very talented writers. We need you to give a portrait of a man who's going to suffer a horrible death, a humiliating death, who is God. And he's got to tell the most amazing stories that will continue to be told. And everything he does has to have the quality of the strange and the unsettling. And he has to appear convincing as a man who is also a god in continents that you four evangelists cannot imagine, and in 2,000 years' time. That's a hard ask. And so the strangeness of Christ, and we've very much been talking about Paul and not really the figure of Jesus. But actually,
that's also because in the book you don't.
Yeah,
really
because I'm not qualified to discuss, what the relationship of
it's
the
a
Gospels
history of idea
is.
book, and it's not a. Yeah.
But the strangeness of Christ in the Gospels is incredibly significant, and the fact that as I said at the beginning, that whatever the Jesus of the Gospels is, he is the greatest short story, the teller of stories, short stories, who's ever lived, the most influential one, is a crucial part of the whole. And yet there is even more than that. And yes, Jesus is humble. He tells Peter to put up his sword. He accepts death at the hands of the Roman state. But he's not just humble. He's terrifying as well. There's a quality of fear and terror about him as well. And there can be no one like Jesus because Jesus is unique, and that is the whole point. If you're a Christian, that is the whole point. But I think even culturally, there is no one like him.
Last
What
question.
advice would you give to European leaders facing Europe with so many challenges right now, given the thesis of Europe's past?
Well, I think that European leaders have faced a huge problem because since the war, Europe has effectively ceased to be a kind of Christian monoculture. Of course, there were always Jews, populations of Jews, but by and large, Europe was a kind of monoculture, whether it was Christian or whether it was post-Christian. Obviously, since the war, that has changed, and European states have now become multicultural states, multi-religious states. And the way that European states have dealt with that is to pretend that the idea of the secular, the idea that there is a kind of neutral space and that there are things called religions that exist separate to the secular space, is a neutral one. In fact, it's not remotely neutral. Because, as we were talking about in the 11th century, this emergence of the idea of there being a dimension of the seculum and a dimension of the church which controls religio over the course of the millennium that follows emerges to become what we now think of as the secular and religion. The deal that is given to European Muslims, as it was given to European Jews in the 19th century, is that they can have freedom of religion, provided that they identify themselves as belonging to things that are called religions. So the Jews in the 19th century had to stop thinking of themselves as they had always done, as belonging to the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, and they had to start thinking of themselves as belonging to a religion called Judaism, a word that Christians had coined in the 2nd century, but no Jews had used until the 19th century. And so equivalently, Muslims have to think of themselves not as belonging to an ummah, not as belonging to a global community of Muslims, but as citizens of nation states who belong to a religion called Islam. And this is what it is to belong in a secular state. This is why European leaders, in the heyday of the kind of liberalism up until, let's say, 9/11, and then even after that, were so reluctant to talk about Europe's Christian heritage, because to do that would draw attention to the way that what, for the effective functioning of the multi-ethnic state, the multicultural state, the secular needs to pretend to be neutral isn't at all. And so I can understand why, notoriously in the preamble to the Lisbon Treaty, initially it said Europe derives its values from Greece and Rome and from the Enlightenment, and left a fairly sizable chunk of European history out of it, and the Pope and everybody kicked up a massive fuss about it. But you could see why, because you can't draw attention to what, in fact, when you look at it, is completely obvious. But I think we're past that now, and I think, therefore, that the best way is for European leaders to be honest about this and to try and say, well, what do we do about it? How do we frame this? How can we acknowledge the fact that the idea of the secular, these ideas that we frame as being universal values are not universal at all. They're not universal. They're bred of, as all ideas are, of cultural contingency, of specific traditions, of specific ways of seeing the world. And it so happens that these ways are essentially Christian. And we need to, I think, if our multicultural societies are to function, I think we now have to accept that and try and work out what we're going to do about it. Because the alternative is that you end up in a situation like France, where laïcité the fact that laïcité is neutral is such a kind of fundamental part of French ideology that people are very, very reluctant to contemplate that might not be the case. And so as a result, you get the French state getting more and more furious with its Muslim citizens for not accepting a principle that, of course, is a fundamentally Christian one. I think we've gone beyond that stage. People need to accept that the idea of the secular, the idea of laïcité, however you want to frame it, and it exists in different contexts and different understandings in different countries. Nevertheless, that is a constant across Europe. These ideas are not culturally neutral. These ideas are bred of the deep subsoil of Christian history and Christian theology. And I think it is more honest to acknowledge that than to pretend it's not the case.